When I say the word art, what do you think of? Who do you think of? You know, art's a funny thing. It's the most pervasive craft known to man, yet still is the least visible. Nonetheless, it is so critical to our existence as a species that not only does it exist in the name of our planet, Earth, it exists in our everyday lives. My name is Michael John McIntosh. I'm an artist and filmmaker. I remember when I first told my grandparents I wanted to go to art school, and my granddad was like, "Black people don't do no art." That really kind of like impacted my relationship with the arts. I remember this other time I was in my room painting. He just kind of stared at me, watching me paint, until I noticed him, and he was like, "Why don't you ever paint any real art? Like a fruit bowl or whatever." I was just like, wow, like, where did he get this idea of what real art is? And why wasn't my art considered to be real art?
Because your grandfather's old school. He grew up in way more repressed than you are. I remember even as a kid going in and see colored and white bathrooms, right? And I couldn't understand it as a kid, you know, to my mom. And she didn't have an answer for me, basically, you know? Painting has always been a luxury item or something, you know, it's not necessarily a sustainable existence. So with that, my parents told me that at one point. They say, "You know what? You want to be a painter full time?" This is in the last probably 20, 25 years. They said, you know, if you had a lot of money, you could do it. But I did it anyway, obviously. And you're doing it too, and a lot of other people did it too. But there is a stigma put upon it because of that. It's financial. And he didn't think you could make a living. Right. He's probably doing you a favor, he thought.
Sometimes there aren't enough black artists out there because that's not a reality for a lot of black people. The reality is you're going to go to work, you're going to raise your children, you're going to take care of them and take care of your responsibilities. If you did have a dream, it's over now because now you have to take care of this responsibility. We're pushed for make money, make money, make money, not be happy. I don't think that's a common theme in a lot of black homes. It's make money. And when you're trying to make money, sometimes your happiness doesn't really matter. And when you're just trying to rise, sometimes it doesn't matter.
The first start date was when I was a kid. My mother, who was an amateur painter, would bring home art materials, and I would, you know, she would paint with me, and I'd do comic book art and this, that, and the other.
My parents were supportive. I don't think that they thought that, like now, since I do it freelance, like I only make art, and that's how I bring in money, I don't ever think they thought it would be the only option.
We live in a world surrounded by art. Your clothes, sneakers, websites, social media, cities, architecture, movies, music, dance, and of course, paintings are all considered forms of art. Art has changed the world on many occasions, especially during the Italian Renaissance.
The church. It's all the church. All the great paintings, all the great sculptures, they're commissions.
A patron's role is vital. They recognize themselves as an appreciator of art and somebody who experiences art. May it be curatorial, may it be personal, may it be random. but it's somebody who buys, appreciates, and supports the arts.
An African Art Overview.
African art is a term used typically when referring to art
From the sub-Saharan region of Africa.
Egypt was also a host to a myriad of art in all forms.
Sculptures representing gods and deities are a common theme in art from empires like Egypt, Carthage, and Nubia.
Even with all of this said, the question still remains.
Where is our Renaissance? Beginning in the 1920s, a great migration occurred in the U.S. 6 million African Americans escaped the racism of the South by moving to northern cities.
During the same time, World War I had just begun.
World War I had galvanized the nation, uniting men, women, and children, young and old, including Black people.
After fighting in World War I, Black veterans would return home expecting the consensus
Of patriotism and unity to continue after the war.
This did not happen.
Racism became too much to bear for many Blacks after World War I.
The summer of 1919 marks the general response Blacks had to the racism they experienced in the South. Coined by James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP,
It was a summer scarred by nationwide racial clashes as a result of mounting tensions post the return of Black veterans from World War I.
You were coming from places that didn't absolutely have the utmost respect for what you wanted to do. And even if they did, it's like, well, that's a pipe dream. That's not really, how you gonna make a living doing that? Get a job at the post office, boy, and do your plays on the weekend, But it's like, no, that's that fierce self-determination.
this inspired a great mass migration to
Northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and Harlem, New York City.
The Harlem Renaissance took place primarily
Between the years of 1919 and the mid-1930s. Artists of all sorts, dancers, musicians, painters, sculptors, even leaders of culture like Marcus Garvey called Harlem home. By the 1920s, the Universal Negro Improvement Association had made Harlem the global headquarters. Marcus Garvey was shaping Black culture.
To me, I always felt like either I was from that era. I had this strong identification with these people. It's like, that's how I felt. There's something about that, that fierce determination that I identified with. I knew when people were telling me, man, you ain't gonna be no actor. How you gonna act? What are you doing? When you heard the naysayers, I could point to something and say, nah, these people were doing this a long time ago. Blacks were in a very, very self-determined place. Determined to be their authentic selves. Very bold and unafraid to be a part of all these other disciplines that people weren't associating us with. It was kind of like, just an amazing collective of people who were like-minded, and I'm going to do what I want to do.
The opinions and concerns of the contemporary Negro were finally being addressed through poems, songs, and paintings.
The concept of self-dependency echoed all throughout Harlem in the form of black business.
Blacks would shop in black-owned restaurants, grocery stores, laundromats,
dry cleaners,
speakeasies,
and black publications
like Crisis and Opportunity. On May 25th, 1925, both Crisis and Opportunity held their first awards for literature. Crisis Magazine, the official magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, was founded in 1910 by W.E.B. Du Bois, acting as editor. Amy Springer, Joel Springer, created the Springer Medal. Opportunity would go on to help establish the careers of black creatives Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Sterling Brown, and Franklin Frazier, who would all become prize winners in May of 1925. An osmosis of Renaissance personalities began to occur. Speakeasies like the Clam House, Nest Club, and the Jungle became places reserved for the in crowd to listen to the new sounds of the day, known as jazz.
Born in New Orleans, Louisiana, a new improvisational form of music known as jazz would become widely popular as a result of blacks leaving the South in cities like New Orleans and taking culture with them to cities in the North, like Harlem, New York City.
All white crowds would be serenaded by the sounds of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, and Jelly Roll Morton at venues like the Cotton Club. The zenith of cool would be broadcasted over the radio waves from the Cotton Club.
Jazz is the first American art form created entirely within the American psyche by African American people. The Harlem Renaissance also represented a style reserved for African Americans that strove to be the creme de la creme of Harlem, New York City. You can see that clearly in how we dressed and how we presented ourselves. Still, in a racist society. When you look at jazz spots like the Cotton Club, people of color couldn't go to the Cotton Club, and that was during the Harlem Renaissance. By 1925, the Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. Immigrants from the South and now the Caribbean continued to pour into Harlem.
What was happening in Harlem caught the attention of a Howard University philosophy professor, Alan Locke. A Philly native, Alan Locke earned a degree in English and philosophy
at Harvard University.
Locke's sojourn into the cultural terrain of the Harlem Renaissance
begins with Alan Locke being selected to be the guest editor of the highly illustrative
Survey Graphic in May of 1925. The Survey Graphic, founded in 1921 by editor Paul Kellogg,
tackled the national and international issues of the day. Quickly becoming an inignorable subject of interest, the Harlem Renaissance would become the topic of discussion in May of 1925.
In an issue entitled Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro. The collection of stories guest edited by Locke would go on to entrance Survey Graphic's white readers of Harlem's cultural offerings.
Art and literature would be paired to tell what was happening in Harlem. To white readers who up until the Survey Graphics issue in March had no idea what was going on. Soon, white patrons would be moved by their curiosity
to witness a new form of music known as jazz in hip speakeasies like the Cotton Club.
Soon, all of the guests at the trendiest spots in Harlem were white.
For all those artists to be in one area and to everything to be happening all the time, it was just a beautiful period. All these artists, great black people making art. That's something I wish I could be a part of, wish I could see.
Later that year, Locke would go on to release an extended version of the issue, with a vast collection of essays, short stories, and interviews from the new children of this era.
Harlem became the subject of study, a microcosm of culture, growing and creating itself. It wouldn't be long before Broadway took notice.
Locke's gatherings in the form of the book The New Negro cemented the Harlem Renaissance as a cultural powerhouse.
Locke recognized the future for the American Negro, author of culture.
Alain Locke would be considered the midwife of the Harlem Renaissance and would go on to collaborate and mentor some of the major figures of the movement, like one of the most colorful personalities of the era,
Zora Neale Hurston. One of the Renaissance's brightest stars and most noted socialite, Zora Neale Hurston proved to be as impactful in African American literature as she was in the cultural scene that was Harlem. Hurston, a former student of Harvard, Baynard, and Columbia University, would set her sights on the Black Mecca of the day, Harlem, New York City. Known for her flair, style, and tenacity, Zora was a mutual friend for many of the heroes of the era. A mentee to Charles Johnson, a colleague of Wallace Thurman, and a contributor to The New Negro with Alain Locke. Not to mention an exemplary party animal, leaving a lasting impression on everyone she met. Works like Colorstruck, Jonah's Gourd Vine, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Spunk, and Sweat were the result of her reflections on life in the Deep South prior to living in the North, a subject that many Harlemites at the time could relate to, as well as her experiences with race in the North. Zora's zeal was the most fitting patina for the period and was key in unifying the period's key players. The end of an era.
By the mid-1930s, the major offerings of the era had already surfaced. Harlem's heyday would come to a slow and grinding halt
due to the stock market crash of 1929, the beginning of what is now known as the Great Depression. On October 24th, 1929, on a day now referred to as Black Thursday, stocks would begin to crash.
The Great Depression would thunderstrike all of America.
Many blue-collar factory jobs would slowly begin to be cut.
And if you managed to still have a job, wages would be cut dramatically.
This meant that the all-white crowds that poured into speakeasies to hear jazz would not have disposable income to spend uptown. As the country settled into the Great Depression, so did Harlem. Working-class families could not afford to stay. By 1932, communism was in full swing. Stalin's crushing grip on Russia was as absolute as his ambitions for global communism. Langston Hughes was among the first to venture to Moscow. for the Soviet Union-funded movie Black and White, a film about the atrocities of racism in the U.S.
The Soviet Union would call to Harlem for the assistance of creatives like
Henry Moon, Louise Thompson, Theodore Poston, and several others.
Speakeasies were drying up, and according to the report on Negro housing,
nearly 50% of all Harlem households would be unemployed by 1931. The tuberculosis rate was 5 times that of whites, and pneumonia was double.
The last new publications from celebrated black literaries would be released between 1931 and 1935. The call for racial equality was too tempting to pass up.
While Russia was also experiencing similar financial turmoil, black creatives were warmly welcomed. Langston Hughes states, "Folks went out of their way to show us courtesy." The goal of Stalin's recruitment of black Americans, also called Communist International, was to spread communist ideals via black revolution in the U.S. The Harlem Riots. March 19th, 1935, marks the end of the Harlem Renaissance. Erupting due to a case of crippling unemployment and police brutality, the Harlem Riots wound up costing New York City $200 million in damages, destroying parts of Harlem for decades to come. Lino Rivera, a 16-year-old black Puerto Rican, was caught stealing a penknife from a department store. After being held by the store manager, police arrived as well as an ambulance. The ambulance leaves empty, as it was sent to address the scratches and bruises from detaining Lino. When the ambulance left, empty because Lino was in police custody, the crowds assumed the worst. The assumption was that Rivera had been killed in police custody. This inspired someone to hurl an object through the store's window, and Harlem was set ablaze. While ending chaotically, the Harlem Renaissance birthed some of the Western world's most brilliant creatives, who produced testaments of African American culture. Today, the figures of the New Negro movement, or the Harlem Renaissance, are all but lost, many finding refuge in Alan Locke's The New Negro. Many of these brilliant elders have been forgotten about, not important enough to be included in arts history education, to lengths comparable to the learnings of the Italian Renaissance. So the question deserves to be asked: why is this important? When I was a kid, only 3 people could fly: Goku, Superman, and Michael Jordan. Jordan changed the game of basketball forever, rendering himself a hero to kids like me. No matter what city you're in, the one common denominator is a basketball court. There's always a point of access. Why? With this imbalance, combined with a steady diet of black bodies playing basketball on TV, is it any wonder why our youth often aspire to join the NBA? It is a matter of exposure. To play basketball, you need sneakers, $15 to $30, shorts, $10, a shirt, $5 to $10, a basketball, $20, and lastly, a basketball court, $0, which can be found literally anywhere. Compare this to, let's say, oil painting. You need a smock, $5, professional oil paint, $37 per tube, brush set, $12, Turpenoid, $22, Canvas roll, $18 per yard. Canvas wood stretcher, $1.60. Staple gun, $12. And lastly, studio space, $500 to $1,000 per month. If you're a single parent, which one is more accessible, basketball or oil painting? Basketball startup cost comes to about $110. Oil painting startup cost comes to about $924. The basketball court that exists will always be more accessible than the studio that does not. After considering that every hood has a basketball court, but not every hood has a dance studio, the comparative lack of exposure to the arts for people of color becomes obvious.